Iraq War 2003 Causes and Consequences. Episode 3 U.S. Oil Security. In 1958, President Dwight David Eisenhower said that the United States government had to protect Israel and the oil positions around the Persian Gulf. Israel and oil, the pillars of U.S. Middle Eastern policy, had been erected as the guideposts for American empire. This is Frank H. Wallis, Ph.D., and in this episode, I'm going to show the continuity of U.S. interest in Persian Gulf oil and its control by American oil companies. Along the way, energy policy morphed into something called energy security, and then again into national energy security. An empire needs energy, and America's irrational energy supply choice at the beginning of the 21st century was oil. Let's first talk about oil security in the Persian Gulf. In 1943, American oilmen such as James A. Moffett urged President Roosevelt to adopt King Ibn Saud and displace the British in Arabia, which took place formally in 1946. The weakening British Empire had no choice. The U.S. government and corporate involvement in Saudi Arabia over the next 60 years was to have profound consequences for the U.S. economy. From 1948 until the late 1950s, Saudi Arabia's main security concern was attack by Israel. With Israel in mind, President Harry S. Truman wrote to King Abdulaziz in October of 1950 that aggression against Saudi Arabia would be a matter of immediate concern to the United States. President Eisenhower repeated these assurances in letters to King Saud and then told Crown Prince Faisal at a meeting at the White House in September of 1957 that the U.S. government will allow no aggression on the part of Israel against the Arab nations. In May 1964, the Department of Defense planned for Saudi security and to safeguard important Western oil and security interests in the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi's spare capacity is usually ample enough to entirely displace the production of another large oil exporting country if supply is disrupted. The kingdom maintained this position to show how important Saudi supplies were to the United States, pressing the United States for both the defense of the kingdom's oil fields and defense of the House of Saud. By 2000, U.S. consumers enjoyed a savings of $620 billion a year from Saudi exports of oil to the United States instead of to more lucrative markets. In return for this major subsidy, the United States government deployed military forces in the Persian Gulf, but taxpayers never knew how much they were paying to protect the House of Saud. By early 1973, domestic refineries were having problems finding domestic supplies of crude oil. So in April 1973, President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced the end of oil import quotas. And overnight, the U.S. became the biggest oil buyer on the planet Earth. By August 1973, the U.S. imported 6.2 million barrels a day, while in 1970 that figure had been 3.2 million barrels a day. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia became the #1 exporter of oil to the U.S. market. Also in the summer of 1973, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt met in secret with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, asking for support in a war on Israel. Faisal gave his approval and also agreed to threaten the United States with the oil weapon. Nixon thought Sadat was just bluffing, but on October 6th, Sadat launched an attack on Israeli forces opposite the Suez Canal. 10 days later, OPEC raised prices by 70% and decided to cut back exports to the United States until it stopped supporting Israel. On October 19th, Nixon announced a $2 billion military aid package for Israel. The very next day, Arab members of OPEC cut off exports to the United States by 100%. The official embargo ended only at Sadat's urging in March of 1974. Although U.S. gasoline prices would rise 40% by December of 1973, the real culprit in the explosion of prices was the American oil cartel. Until partial reforms in 1975, the major oil companies, which managed the majority of Middle East oil production, operated largely tax-free due to such arcane tax loopholes as percentage depletion and expensing of intangible drilling costs, and of course a gigantic foreign tax credit. The majors needed to find new sources of financing, which required upping the profit margins. In the year of OPEC, the Yom Kippur War, Nixon's Watergate problem, and the Vietnam War, 1973 saw the American majors double their profit margin. By some mysterious force, all of the big oil companies attained this goal in 1974. The world economy went into recession and inflation, which did not end until well into the Reagan era of the 1980s. The OPEC members realized about $67 billion in net profits from this price mania. In 1975, John Blair, the staff director of the Senate investigation of multinational corporations, especially into American oil company profits, wrote that even with conservation and alternate fuels, the United States would need more and more Middle East oil, which would mean more and more U.S. government involvement in the Middle East. He predicted that control of oil in the world economy would hinge on control of the Middle East, principally Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran. His assessment has been prophetic. The role of major American oil companies as multinational corporations must be clarified. The government, and particularly the Department of State, had long believed that only American oil companies could be trusted to safeguard the continuity of oil supply to the United States. Consequently, major American oil companies have been supported in their deals with Persian Gulf countries by the Department of State since the 1920s. Because the struggle for oil concessions in the Middle East was an integral part of imperialism in the 20th century, and because oil was vital to all military operations of the great powers, oil would be taken into account in diplomacy among nations, and the interest of private oil companies would serve as a handy linchpin for U.S. government intervention. The United States government has always had an interest in the Persian Gulf for one reason: to protect the flow of oil. Arab ownership of oil was not exactly the same as control. The U.S. government had determined that American oil companies were the answer to the problem of secure access to oil. The proper role of the United States government was to set the conditions for penetration of American oil companies into the Middle East. Big Oil was not just another interest group, it was a tool of foreign policy. Paul Nitze and the Petroleum Division of the Department of State proposed in 1949 that the United States had a vital interest in American-owned oil assets in the Middle East. The goal was U.S. control of world oil supply. So beginning in the 1940s, U.S. policy was that Americans had a preemptive right to control petroleum. Addressing the demand side of oil consumption was never government policy, and would certainly not be under George Bush, because energy-related investment decisions have been in the hands of private sector multinationals, certainly not under the control of consumers. During the 1960s, high-level officials from the Department of State and the United Kingdom's Foreign Office held regular meetings about Gulf issues, mostly how to keep Iraq from taking over Kuwait and how to keep the oil flowing to Europe. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson was concerned only to keep the oil flowing out of the Persian Gulf to allies in Japan and Europe, and to preventing the Soviets and Chinese from coming in. This Cold War mania for influence in the region would keep the lid on local hegemonic aspirations among Gulf states until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. By this time, most of the Gulf potentates and Saudi were managing oil in the interest of the United States in return for security, which had the side effect of producing dictatorships. Accordingly, in 1990, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invaded Kuwait in a futile bid to extort $100 billion from a fellow OPEC member whom the tyrant suspected of manipulating oil prices, depressing world oil prices, and retarding Iraqi oil revenues needed to rebuild the country after Saddam's disastrous U.S.-backed war against Iran. Bush I organized an international coalition to successfully eject Saddam from Kuwait in 1991. Just previously, the Republican Reagan administration reversed energy policy almost entirely toward a Cold War military orientation. Vehicle fuel efficiency standards were rolled back. Federal R&D for energy efficiency was cut 70%, and for renewables, nearly 90%. Most federal subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, tens of billions of dollars a year, were maintained. Subsidies for renewables were eliminated. From 1994 to 1998, imported oil grew from 8 million barrels a day to 10 million barrels a day, from 45% to 51% of domestic consumption, of which Persian Gulf imports grew from 1.7 million barrels a day to 2.1 barrels a day. Increased imported oil was seen as a threat to national security, and in the late 1990s, the U.S. paid out between $30 billion and $60 billion a year for stability in the Gulf, all for protecting the import into the United States of $30 billion worth of oil. The American majors were getting quite a deal at taxpayer expense. In 2001, a decision was made in the Bush White House to continue down the road of rising petroleum consumption, which would bind the United States ever more tightly to Persian Gulf suppliers, with a corresponding impact on American security policy. Bush II energy policy did not propose to reduce consumption of oil. It proposed to slow the growth of U.S. dependence on imported oil by increasing domestic production. The Department of Defense planned to secure the oil fields of Iraq as a first priority in an invasion. With oil reserves second only to Saudi Arabia, the Bush II regime saw that Iraq would become a significant supplier in the years to come. Bush II military strategy of quick response forces capable of enforcing American order across the globe with long-distance capabilities had oil as the goal. Iraq in 2003 was only comprehensible in light of access to Persian Gulf oil and the ultimate control over that oil by the United States multinationals. Bush energy policy was predicated on ever-growing consumption of oil, and it was likely that the United States-controlled Iraq would be the fulcrum of a new order in the world oil industry. United States and British multinationals had been dominating the international oil industry for decades. Industry experts estimated Iraqi reserves at 400 billion barrels, with a profit potential of $3 to $9 trillion if the price was $25 a barrel. Why wouldn't the United States and British oilmen seek to gain a special relationship with Iraqis, with the aid of their governments? Britain had been a staunch, almost knee-jerk supporter for United States interventions for decades. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher thought it was a splendid idea that Ronald Reagan was killing the communists in Central America during the 1980s. Under Prime Minister Tony Blair, there was a new phase of British military intervention. The Pentagon's creation of Central Command, or CENTCOM, was tasked with the control of the Middle East in 1983, which heralded a new era for American control of Persian Gulf oil. Under Bush II, Richard Armitage, Deputy Secretary of State, stated that oil, although plentiful, was fundamental for American economic growth, defense, and transportation. Its supply must be assured. He emphasized that secure access to the Persian Gulf would be fundamental to the security interests of the United States. The United States must continue to lead the state system and assure the affordable flow of oil upon which the global economy depended. Standard conservative precept of non-interference in the free market had to be ignored by the United States government when it came to oil. Bush's Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, stated that the Gulf was unstable with both Saddam and revolutionary Iran in the neighborhood. Iraqi control of Saudi Arabia was a possibility that must be prevented at all costs. Energy security for the United States meant averting another oil embargo and preventing Saddam Hussein from spending oil revenue on weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. would remain in the Gulf as long as the United States needed Gulf oil. Terrorist attacks on the United States on 9/11/2001 allowed Bush II to formulate and carry out an oil security policy in light of both previous concerns and perceived instability on the Imperial periphery. Instability was not acceptable. The major oil corporations demanded stable markets. The state demands stable neighbors. Corporatism demands government support for ensuring stable markets. Therefore, it is no surprise that the United States government under George Bush demanded a stable Persian Gulf. The material interest of American oil elites provided enough motive for the United States government to launch a preemptive expedition into the Persian Gulf to ensure stability at the periphery of the empire. Under Bush II, a new security paradigm was announced. Although the motives looked very traditional, with continuity going back to President Roosevelt. This is your Empire historian, Frank H. Wallis, Ph.D. Thank you for listening and thinking.